Hey everyone, it's Dr. Wenger. So I accidentally recorded this lecture the wrong way. So I'm going to record an abbreviated version of it with just a really stripped down bare bones sort of thing. I'm at home right now, so you might hear my kids. We'll see what happens. Yeah, hi Calvin. Calvin, can you say hi? Yeah, there we go. All right. So pollination. This lecture is all about pollination services. So again, you guys are all plant science or viticulture majors, so I won't go into great detail about this. But just a reminder, right, in order to produce fertile seeds, all plants need to be pollinated. The pollen needs to be transmitted from the stamen to the female reproductive parts of the flower. And typically this is either done by wind, if they have very light pollen, or it may include pollination agents. If the pollen is heavy and sticky. I took the kid's snack. He did not like that. Anyway, flowers are considered to either be self-compatible or self-pollinators if they are capable of pollinating themselves with their own pollen, either within the same flower or between flowers on the same plant, or they're considered cross-fertile or require cross-pollination if they must pollinate between separate plants, either by their own means or through artificial fertilization or pollination. There's actually any number of ingenious evolutionary pathways that plants have to avoid self-pollination, and the reason for this is that cross-pollination mixes up the genes, it increases plant vigor, it increases fruit set. It's generally better for the species as a whole, so plants that cross-pollinate tend to produce more young and survive better. In many cases, like in the primrose, the way they get around this is the plant has stamens that are shorter than the pistil, so that if pollen is produced, it will sink to the bottom of the flower rather than actually pollinating the flower. Other plants will have pollen and ovaries that mature at different times, so you never have the two mature at the same time in the same flower. And in many cases, plants just are able to recognize their own pollen and will remain infertile. A really common way that plants separate out flowers is through monoecious and dioecious setups. Monoecious flowers or plants are plants where the male and female flowers are put on different parts of the same plant, so they don't come into contact with each other. Typically in these situations, you'll have one set of flowers that are pistillate, meaning that they only have the female morphology, they don't have the male, sort of this flower we see here on this cucurbit. Or in the case of corn, that would be sort of the silks on the cob would be the female. And then they'll have staminate flowers, those that lack female morphology, this one and the tassel. And the idea is you're basically just separating the male and female parts by a good distance so that it's unlikely that the pollen will go from here to here so much as it will go from a separate staminate flower on a separate plant onto these particular silks. On dioecious plants, this is just, or dioecious plants, it's just a step further. The female and male flowers exist on completely separate plants. You'll have male plants that only have male flowers and female plants that only have female flowers. So basically you have plants with distinct sexes. Probably the most common plant that you'll deal with here in Central California that's like this is the pistachio. All right. Now, this is just a bit of an anomaly that I pointed out in the lecture. It's not something I'm going to test you on, so I'm not going to go into detail. But my point was that there are some cases where actually we don't want any sort of pollination from insects, because insects are really the drivers of most pollination in crops. Rather, we want to control it extremely. In greenhouses, this is a good case. Bees are poorly suited to indoor habitats, so we don't have bees in greenhouses. They have to pollinate by other means. And used to be that you would pollinate tomatoes with a vibrating toothbrush. Oh, here comes somebody. Hi, Calvin. Hey, Silas. Are you done?
I saw Calvin come out here and wanted him to stay with me.
Oh, I'm sure he'll come back. Are you almost done?
Yeah, almost.
All right, let me know when you're done.
Okay.
All right, we're just going to skip that human pollination thing. let's just jump to the insect pollination. So the idea of insect pollination, right, is basically that uh, flowers evolved in angiosperms right around the time that insects evolved wings, and so insects and flowers became intimately related to one another in that insects were interested in getting resources from flowers, and plants were interested in having something to transmit their pollen for them. There's a large range of insects that can serve as pollinators, including many things we consider pests, such as aphids and thrips. But all in all, bees and leps are really the ones that we consider to be the primary pollinators. So anyway, uh, while there are a wide range of insects that are pollinators, what we find is there's a greater and greater need for commercial pollinator services for people who raise insects for the purposes of pollination. And the reason for this is that in the past we could really rely on a lot of native pollinators to do the job of pollination. But now with heavy pesticide use, forage being harvested earlier than ever, grazing lands being overgrazed, and increasing suburbanization and urbanization, we just see less and less land is available for native pollinators to live on. In addition to this, agriculture has moved away from a system where we had many different crops being grown on one location so that blooms were always available. We're moving to a system where we basically grow one crop in a large area. So we have these monocultures where you'll basically have one major bloom period, and for the rest of the year there's no forage available for pollinators. Consequently, it's now incredibly important that forage be made available, that people basically raise insects and bring them along. This is something we talked about in economic entomology, but overall, in a landscape where pollinators are needing to be brought in, bees are seen as the major pollinator. They are super easy to rear in mass, well, compared to other insects, and they're pretty darn good at pollinating things. In fact, honeybees are so excellent at pollinating food that roughly 35% of all food products are pollinated by honeybees at one point or another. These break down roughly into obligate crops that require bees in order to set fruits, melons, squashes, kiwis, odds and ends like that. There are great need crops where pollination can be done without bees, but the plants don't do so well. This would be our stone fruits, apples, and almonds. Moderate need crops, which don't require bees at all for fertilization, but bees are associated with significant yield boosts. And then there are a handful of crops where you don't need bees, and you see a very small yield boost, so people usually don't bother bringing bees in to fertilize them or pollinate them. So, all in all, these crops, when you consider ones that are great need and above, are valued at about $14 billion, which is 10% of the global diet and about 35% of the developed world's diet, like here in the US. We eat a lot of vegetables and fruits. So when I say bees, we're talking about honeybees a lot in this course. I wanted to point out that there are actually a lot of bees that are used for fertilization services, and there's a handful of them that are really starting to get a lot of attention here in the US. The first of which is the alfalfa leafcutter bee, or Megachile rotunda. So Megachile rotunda is it's a common alfalfa pollinator, and here on the West Coast, it's kind of the big dog. It's the one that goes out and does the vast majority of the pollination services. These guys are known for nesting in tube-shaped cavities, usually in hollow reeds, but in commercial blocks. What they do is they take these big wooden blocks and they drill a bunch of holes in them for them to nest in. You'll get a bunch of these blocks and put them outside of your alfalfa field if you're making seed alfalfa that needs pollinated. The females will fly out, collect pollen and nectar, create these little balls that they'll lay an egg on, and then they'll create a leaf cell to house that little ball before they go out and create another ball. And they'll put maybe about 10 or a dozen of these little cells in one of these single tubes. It'll end up looking like this, completely lined with alfalfa leaves. And what's kind of cool is that once one of these things is full, or about 70 to 80% of the cells are full, these blocks can be removed from the field, they'll be stored at room temperature until they've accumulated about 209 degree days, at which point the offspring will have reached the pupal stage, and they could be overwintered. At that point, these blocks are dried out. They're put at cold temperatures. They're shaken and turned over to shake out dead pupa, dead larvae, excess leaves. And then they can be stored at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, basically for an indeterminate amount of time. And when it's time to go out and pollinate another alfalfa field, they just pull them out of cold storage and they use them to pollinate the field. So a very similar sort of system to honeybees. Another major pollinator is the alkali bee, or Namia millanderi. This is a native to North America, and they're a native to the West Coast, where we have this sort of ideal soil for them, where basically you have an alkaline soil that is dry most of the year and is stuck right above a hard pack layer, or a hard pan layer. And basically, these guys will build their little tunnels in the ground and heap up the dirt on the top. If you have a nice patch of soil that's just right, you'll end up with very big populations. These bees are super effective pollinators of alfalfa. Actually, they're considered to be highly complementary to the alfalfa leaf cutters, because these guys like to pollinate the bottommost flowers, whereas the leaf cutters like to pollinate the topmost flowers. So they kind of are a 1-2 punch in Western seed production. But anyway, what growers do to cultivate these is oftentimes they'll take a patch of soil just outside their field, like they are in this picture, and they will clear it, and they will just avoid irrigating it as often as possible, and basically seed it, oftentimes, or punch holes in it and then seed it with alkali bees. And they'll just sort of set up shop and be a permanent forage or a permanent pollination resource. In addition to this, sometimes people will create artificial habitats in tubs of soil, but this is super labor intensive and it's hard to move around large enough tubs full of soil and bees. Another major bee is the BO bee, or the bob. This is called the blue orchard bee, Osmia lignaria, and this is a super popular bee in East Asia. China, Korea, Japan, they like this guy as a pollinator of stone fruits and various orchard crops. That's why it's called an orchard bee. Okay, I'm back. Anyway, these guys are tube nesters. Basically they're about 6-inch tubes with about maybe 1/4 of an inch diameter, and they lay their eggs in there, much like the alfalfa cutter bees do. And what you can do is just purchase a pack of about 200 tubes of these, and it's been shown that about 1,000 BOB that are in those 200 tubes are about as effective as a hive of bees at pollinating an acre of almonds. So they're pretty darn good pollinators. They're, in effect, much more efficient at pollinating orchard crops than almonds are. They seem to be well adapted to that system. In addition to this, it seems that they're actually highly complementary to honeybees in pollination style, in that if you were to put 200 tubes of these out in the field, as well as a hive of honeybees, you actually get higher forage than you would if you had just one bee or the other species. You end up with much higher pollination because their two styles are complementary. Now, there was a lot of effort put into rearing a large number of these by Wonderful. Wonderful actually funded research into these bees for 8 years because they did not want to be beholden to a single pollinator or indeed the honeybee industry. But unfortunately, they couldn't rear enough of these to sustain their entire orchard production system. It wasn't cost effective, so they shuttered it in 2018. And I've been trying to figure out what's been going on with this, but everybody's being really tight-lipped. It's not clear why it is that they shut it down, because it seemed they were pretty close at hitting their goals. And finally, buff-tailed bumblebees are becoming a very popular pollinator because we're seeing a major shift towards rearing crops inside of greenhouses. And while honeybees do not forage in greenhouses, they need to be outside, bumblebees don't mind at all. They'll buzz around in greenhouses, they'll pollinate strawberries, they'll pollinate tomatoes like this. And so in these major production greenhouses that are giving like basically, you know, organic tomatoes to like Costco and stuff, we see that they'll use stacks and stacks of these guys to perform their pollination. But that being said, this is really in its infancy, and so there's not a whole lot of common practice in how you raise these things. Now, that being said, we talked about those 4 different species, but I'd just like to point out that far and away, honeybees are still the most common commercial insect pollinator. This is for a variety of reasons. One is that honeybees are a perennial colony, right? They're always around. You can basically pull honeybees out and use them to pollinate at any given time. They only use nectar and pollen as their food source, so they are dependent on your flowers. Excuse me. They also have flower constant behavior, meaning that once they've learned how to pollinate a single type of flower, they will show preference to that flower and only use it for a while. On top of this, these guys are flower generalists, so they pollinate a wide range of flowers. If you look at like alfalfa leafcutters and alkali bees, they tend to be highly specialized. BOB tend to focus on orchards. Honeybees will pollinate just about anything if they can get their mouth parts into it. They also are really good at foraging under a wide range of weather conditions. They're not really picky, like many bee species are. They don't like to fly if it's even just slightly windy. And also these guys produce a lot of secondary products. Honey, wax, propolis, royal jelly, all that stuff that allows people to make extra money off the hive besides pollination. So let's say you're raising a colony for pollination services, and you want to basically get the biggest bang for your buck. You want to do a good job. How do you raise a colony for pollination? What are the management practices? Well, I was impressed when I looked into this how very similar the management practices for pollination were to the practices for making honey, right? Where basically what you want for pollination is the same thing you want for honey, which is a good, strong, populous colony with lots and lots of foragers that are going to show up right around the projected bloom date, right? You want to move a colony in, you want to have a ton of foragers, and you want them to be there for the bloom. It makes sense. In general, what you want inside the hive is you want expanding brood. You want the brood to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger, because the more brood there is, the more brood pheromone there is, and brood pheromone, right, is the trigger for pollen foraging. If you have a lot of brood, you're going to have a high proportion of pollen foragers, you're going to get better pollination. On top of that, single brood boxes are recommended, like these ones we have in the picture. Simple hives where you have one box. The idea here is twofold. One, these boxes are going to be lighter, smaller, easier to move, much easier for pollination services. The second one is that when the bees come back foraging and go into the hive, if there's only a brood box, they're going to have to crawl right across those brood cells to get to the deposit sites up in the top corners. And that's going to put them directly in contact with that brood pheromone, and it's going to really home and put into them the idea that they need to be going out there and collecting pollen. Now, there's a bit of a conflict here, which is that if you're sitting here providing small colonies, growers are going to look at that, they're going to say, hey, that's less foragers than if you gave me a great big strong hive. So growers want larger colonies, pollination services want to provide smaller ones, and say the smaller ones might be better. Just a little bit of a conflict. Now, one of the big challenges we see with pollination is that the very most important pollination for making your money is going to be the almond pollination. That's the one where you can get the highest price per hive. And that's also super early in the season when our hives don't have a lot of brood, when our hives aren't very large. They're actually at their weakest. They just came out of the winter and they're struggling, right? So how do we prepare a hive for these early spring blooms like apples and almonds? Well, one thing you can do is what we always do when we need to boost the hive, which is you can feed it sugar syrup and protein patties, right? You do that coming out of winter. This is going to get your bees buzzing, laying down brood, and starting to grow early. The other thing you can do is you can look around at your hives. You can see, what are my weak hives, what are my strong hives, and you can start bolstering them, right? You can start taking brood from the strong colonies, putting into your weak colonies. You can combine your weak colonies together, and you can also start combining nuclei together, or nukes together, to create stronger hives. On top of that, when you put your hives out into the orchard, you can also provide them with syrup. If you give the bees sugar syrup while they're in the orchard, this will basically make the bees think they have a ton of nectar available to them already, and it will cause a lot of bees to switch from being nectar foragers to pollen foragers. Oops. So that's one thing you can do, right? You can just try and boost your hives as much as possible before you put them in. Now, once you have the hives in the crop, what can you do to improve your pollination results? Well, one thing you can do is probably the most obvious thing, which is put the hives as close as possible to the crop you want pollinated. This seems pretty plain and obvious, right? But it's not always easy to do. Sometimes the crop is not sitting in an ideal piece of land. Maybe it is near various houses or schools and people aren't comfortable putting bees right by it. But the research on this is really, really clear. Pollen foragers tend to stay close to the hive as possible when they're foraging. They don't like to make long trips if they can help it. Nectar foragers will travel a long way to find good nectar sources, but pollen foragers basically say, pollen is pollen, it's good enough. So basically, what research has shown is that if you put hives close to a field, you get better pollination. There was some research in Europe where basically they looked at orchards that had hives within 0.3 kilometers, around 1 kilometer, and then around 2 kilometers away. And what they showed was that when the hives were close, you had nearly double the harvest of apples in terms of kilograms per hectare as you would when they were a mile away or 2 miles, or 1 kilometer away or 2 kilometers away. Similarly, they showed that if you looked at them in terms of the amount of that's supposed to be crop, if you looked at bees that were where the hives were in the crop 0.5 kilometer or 0.8 kilometers away, and you looked at the pollen that they were collecting and bringing back to the hive, they showed that in various crops, bees that were close to the crop, such as kale, fava bean, or red clover, collected a high percentage of pollen from those crops compared to bees that were further away, right? As we move away from kale and fava bean, we collect less kale and fava bean pollen. This did not hold for red clover. Apparently, bees will travel a good distance for red clover. Another thing that will improve those pollination results is distributing your hives evenly, right? Again, if these bees are going to forage preferentially near the hives, then if you want to pollinate the whole field relatively evenly, you need to make sure that your bees are going to be relatively evenly spread throughout the field so that you don't have some areas that get a lot of pollination and some areas that don't. The trick for this, though, is that if I spread my bees out evenly, 1 per acre, 1.5, 2 per acres, 2 per acre, it's going to be really hard for me to go out to that block of orchard and make good inspections of them, because I'm going to have to drive my truck all over God's good earth in order to see them. So typically, beekeepers want to clump their bees as much as possible, while growers want them to be spread out. And you're going to have to find some sort of compromise with the grower, where you spread them out a little bit. Maybe a couple little clusters spread out, every, 100 feet or something. In addition to this, you also want to avoid competing plants. So it is known that bees will avoid crops that are hard for them to forage on or are distasteful for them if there are better alternatives nearby. So, for example, a lot of bees don't really like to pollinate cole crops. And if given the choice between cole crops and some nice weeds, they oftentimes will go for the weeds. And so if you're in a pollination setting where the bees aren't going to go for it, you might want to remove those attractive weeds. Alternatively, when you move bees into a crop like the almond orchard or something, you probably want to move them in just as the flowers are starting to open, or right after they've been open for a little while. Because if you move the bees in too early and they're out buzzing around looking for forage, and there's no almond flowers available, then the bees are going to find something else to feed on. They're going to find some weeds. They're going to imprint on those weeds. They're going to learn how to forage on them. And when the almonds come out, they're not going to want to pollinate those almonds anymore. They're going to go for something else. They're going to go for those weeds. So you just need to be careful. And then lastly, sort of the last question I see coming up and over again is, how many hives should I put out for an optimal pollination? And the reality is that the idea of 1 hive per acre is thrown around a lot. This is the first number that was put out. It's sort of an intuitive sounding thing. It sounds like folk wisdom. But the reality is we just don't have any research to support the idea of 1 hive per acre. It's not based on any research. It's just sort of an experiential thing that people have been saying for a long time. And in general, it's just sort of become the standard for a wide range of crops, except for like those that have really high densities where, you might need more hives. The reality is that if we think about pollination, what really matters is a whole bunch of variables, not just hives. It's going to depend on the crop, right? Is the crop easy to visit? How efficient is every visit? Are we getting pollination from a single bee visit, or do you have to visit the flower 3 or 4 times before it gets pollinated? How are the pollen grains deposited? Do they need to be deposited evenly across the pistil, or can you just have a single deposit? How strong is your hive, right? Are we talking about hives with lots and lots of foragers, or are there relatively few foragers? The point is, it's all contextual. 1 really strong hive might be enough to pollinate an entire acre, or maybe 2 acres of alfalfa. On the flip side, 1 really strong hive might not be enough to pollinate an entire acre of high density almond. It's all contextual. And then lastly, there's a question of, well, if I'm doing this pollination services, how should I be charging for it? And what we find is that generally growers will rent pollination by the hive as their unit, right? You pay per hive. And this is typically regardless of strength. So basically you say, I'm going to need 2 hives per acre. I want 200 hives for my 100 acres of crop. And what we find is that crop by crop, you get a huge variability in price, right? With generally almonds receiving about twice as much money as the next competitor, which is blueberries. The main reason for this is just the sheer volume of almonds. We have, what is it, we have like millions and millions of acres of almonds, right? And so it's going to take millions of hives of bees to pollinate. We ship about 50% of all hives into California for pollination. I'll talk about this in the next lesson when we go into the individual crops, so I'm not going to belabor the point here. But the point is that you're going to expect a different price. So growers can get a bit testy if they say they need, if they're paying $165 or $200 for a hive to pollinate their almonds, and they get the hives and they think they look a little bit small. So oftentimes, in addition to paying by the unit, growers will put in a minimum size requirement for the hives they rent, meaning that they demand that each given hive has a certain number of bees in it, because pollination efficiency is really driven by the amount of foraging bees in the hive, not by the hive itself. So the way they estimate hive size is by looking at the number of workers on the brood comb and basically saying, okay, about 8, I lost my train of thought. We look at the number of brood combs and how many workers are on those brood combs, and we use that as a measure of hive strength. Generally, if you're working with an early season crop like almonds, you're going to have less requirements. In almonds, the minimum hive strength is usually 8 combs of brood covered with workers. But if you're working with a later season crop, say like pumpkins, watermelons, or blueberries, they may have a higher demand. They may say, hey, we want more like 12 to 16 frames of brood with workers on them. And then lastly, before I go, yeah, we'll talk about the props later, but lastly, what I'd like to point out is that if you're ever working with somebody, if you're ever renting hives, it's super important that you get a contract. There have been so many cases of people's bees getting sprayed with pesticides, growers refusing to pay, beekeepers providing fewer bees than they said they would, and it can become such a legal mess. What you want is, if something happens to your hives, or if a grower is upset, you want to be able to walk into the courtroom with a piece of paper to give to the judge that basically says, I did exactly what I was going to say. I did exactly what I said I would do according to this paper that I signed and the grower signed, right? You want to have a legal cover. And so if you're going to do that, in general, what you're looking for here is going to be a contract that specifies the number and strength of colonies you provide, how they're going to be distributed, and when they're going to be delivered. On top of that, it's going to define your rights as the beekeeper to come in to the field and to move the bees in case pesticides are being applied. And on top of that, it's going to spell out who's going to get paid and how, right? It's going to include a plan for the payment of the rental fee, penalties for poor quality or service from you, penalties for a breach of contract by the grower, and also any sort of bonuses or penalties you want to put in for your services. There's actually a really nice website. Actually, if you go to most any county ag office, they have examples of pollinator contracts. Cornell put together a nice 2-page contract right here at this extension that I like. It's basically a 2-page PDF where you just type in the information directly, and it's considered a legal form, and so you should check that out. So with that, that's my hyper-condensed version of the hour-long lecture I gave before. I'll see you all later.